Welcome to the Bare Essentials Podcast, where the talk is real and hibernating on your goals is not an option.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this very powerful episode of the Bare Essentials. Today's episode will take you through a myriad of emotions, ranging from sadness, blame, grief, adversity, forgiveness, and most importantly, show an amazing example of the power of the human spirit's ability to overcome. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our next guest. He is a husband, father, speaker, and author of the book, Kevin's Last Walk. Please, let's welcome Barry Adkins to the show. Hi, Barry. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Charles. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's really great to have you. And we were talking a little bit before this, before we started here. And I just want to say to you personally that I admire your courage so much. And I think what you're doing here is so important. And I'm really hoping that your message will get through to the audience and help some people. And maybe if this touches one person and saves one person's child, I think that we accomplished our mission here today, Barry. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
So really, I'm that guy. I'm just the everyday guy that, never imagined I'd be here doing podcasts or any of this other stuff. I grew up in Montana, lived in Alaska, and here I am. I'm just an everyday American that happened to have something happen to him that changed his life.
Yeah, and Barry, with that being said, I know your book, Kevin's Last Walk. So obviously a big message here we want to talk about is your son, Kevin. Before we get into what happened to Kevin, I really would like to hear a bit about Kevin, about his life, about who he was.
So Kevin, unfortunately, was a little bit like his old man. He wasn't a very good student. His grades were bad. And, you got to go in for parent-teacher conferences when kids are young, when they're in elementary school. And I know what the teachers are going to tell me when I walk in there, but they always found something nice to say about him. They always talked about what a good heart he had and how kind he was. He actually befriended a boy by the name of David when he was in third grade. David was in a wheelchair, so it was hard for him to make friends, but Kevin was that guy. They got David around school and got him to the playground, back to class, and occasionally they would get him over to our house. Third grade boys, they have an interesting rules. They actually would leave the wheelchair at the front door. And Kevin would either drag David around the house or David would army crawl around the house. That's just how Kevin was. And when he got his driver's license, honestly, he scared me to death because he's the guy that stops on the freeway and gives a complete stranger a ride or helps him change a tire. He told me stories that honestly scared me to death, but I didn't want to tell him not to do it. So we just let it go.
Yeah. And Barry, just reading a little bit about Kevin myself before we did this and you and your family, I would say, sounds like, to your point, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree as far as Kevin. And I mean, credit to you, though. It really seems like you raised a very kind and generous young man. And I think obviously when a tragedy happens, we never think it can happen to us, our family, right? And I think it makes it even harder when you have the person that it happens to is such a kind and generous human being. We don't have enough of them in this world, and we always wonder why, right? So I know with Kevin, you mentioned this driver's license. Could you tell the audience a little bit about a story you told? I heard you tell, and I thought it was powerful. You went with Kevin, I believe, to help him with a truck.
He bought a truck.
Okay.
And basically, I'm a crusty old dude, right? I told him he was going to have to, he wanted me to co-sign the loan. So I made him give me 3 months worth of insurance payments and car payments before I'd agree to co-sign the loan. And I'm hoping he's going to find one at a dealership. I don't have to, or rather not find one at the dealership. And then I just private party, go down the credit union, you know the drill. 5 minutes later, you're out of there, right? He found one at a dealership, and I go down there to sign the papers. The first thing the financial guy says to me is, "How about some life insurance?" And I'm thinking, oh, here we go. I said, "Look, dude, I don't need any life insurance. My wife will do just fine if something happens to me." And he looked at me and said, "I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about your son." And I'm that guy. I'm that guy who rather indignantly told him 18-year-old boys don't need life insurance because they don't die. But I was wrong. They do die. He wouldn't live long enough to make a single payment on that truck.
Wow, that just I would Barry, myself being a father, it hits home to me. I'm sure it's going to hit home with a lot of people. So Kevin gets that truck, being 18. Not only now he has a truck, it sounds like Kevin was ready to set out and conquer the world. So tell a little bit about he comes to the house one day to you and his mom, and probably surprises you guys, but all of a sudden he has his truck. He's moving out, huh?
Yeah. So I remember him coming in, and he sat down in this brown chair that sits in front of a big picture window that looks out over our backyard. And he started talking about how he couldn't believe that his life was finally beginning and he wanted to move out. And honestly, I did my best to discourage him because we really never had any problems with him. His high school principal didn't even know who he was, but I didn't have any luck talking him out of it. So a couple of weeks later, he started the process of moving out. He's 18 years old. It involved a bed, a TV, and a dresser in the back of his new truck. Then he came back in, put his jeans on, and he came back in to the room and told me something I've never forgotten. He said he wasn't going to take his toothbrush with him, that he'd be back tomorrow and get it. I walked out front with him like I normally do, gave him a hug, told him that I loved him and to be careful, and watched him drive away. It was the last time I saw him alive.
Well, so Kevin, he gets a place of his own. Now that night, he leaves your house that night, like kids do, going to have a bit of a housewarming party, and this is like rite of passage for kids, right? They're going to have friends over, they're going to drink, they're going to do things. And to them, it's, nothing bad's going to come of this, right? This is going to be, in their eyes, epic. You have a place, we're going to have a party. And like I said, they think they're invincible, unfortunately, for kids. We all been through it, but kids especially, they think it can't happen to them, that nothing bad will happen to them. So could you, I know this is tough, but could you tell us what happens next?
So they had a housewarming party, started with beer, moved on to shots. He left a voicemail for his sister sometime after midnight, talking about how drunk he was and how he loved his nephew Colin more than anything in the whole world. He passed out a short time after that. The people at the party laid him in his bed on his side in case he vomited. But his buddy Craig was worried about him and kept going back in to check on him. Around 4 a.m., calls started coming into 911. The first calls were difficulty breathing. The next calls were not breathing. My son died alone in a hospital while I slept peacefully in my bed.
Well, I'm Barry, God, I can't even imagine what you and your family went through with that happening. So you're asleep. How did you find out?
So the next morning, it was Sunday morning, my wife and I are doing what a lot of couples do on Sunday morning. We're drinking coffee, talking about what we're going to do or not do that day. And about 8:30 in the morning, the doorbell rings, and we're looking at each other like, what? Who's at our house? Nobody's supposed to be coming over. And I open the door and I see two police officers and a person in plain clothes standing at my front door. That should have been a big red flag, right? But I'm that guy. it didn't even occur to me that something bad had happened. I actually joked with them as they came in thinking, this has to have something to do with a dog or a parked car. I had nothing. But they didn't laugh at any of my jokes. One of the officers and the person in plain clothes stayed by the front door. The other officer walked in and stood in front of that brown chair that Kevin had sat in 2 weeks before and talked about how his life was finally beginning. He said there'd been an accident, that your son is dead. We asked who, because we have a number of children. He said it was Kevin, and he handed me his driver's license. There's something pretty final about it when a police officer hands you your child's driver's license, because until that exact moment in time, I still remember it to this day, until that exact moment in time, you're holding out hope. But this is all just a big mistake. You need the Kevin Adkins on the other side of town. You've misspelled the last name. You need to at least be next door, right? But when they hand you your child's driver's license, you know he's gone. And he's never coming back.
Okay. Gosh, Barry, do you ever blame anybody, like anyone at the party? Do you blame those kids? Blame yourself? Blame Kevin? What type of emotions do you go through?
These are good questions, Charles. We figured out early on that the blame game isn't going to help anything. He's gone. We can't bring him back. Of course, there's the forgiveness part for me, which we'll get into later. But what good is it going to do? It's not going to bring him back. And I don't know. We just agreed early on that we weren't going to do that, because he left a voicemail for his sister that night. People often ask, did I know he drank? Well, no, I did not. There was a couple of times I suspected it. And I will say that quite often people think, well, they'll let him party at the house. Well, his biological mother, we were divorced. I had custody of the kids. She was letting them come over to her house and party there, and she would let them do that. I don't blame her. Kevin's the one that ultimately made that decision. At the end of the day, we're responsible for our own choices, and this is something he did.
And Barry, I want to make it clear to the audience, because I don't want this to be confused, because I think a lot of attention gets paid to when it comes to alcohol with teenagers and young adults. A lot of it has to do with drunk driving. I want to make it clear to the audience listening and watching, this wasn't drunk driving. This is, and a lot of people don't realize this, that it happens, and it happens more often than I think people really understand that it can happen, is that Kevin died from alcohol poisoning, nothing to do with getting in a vehicle and driving. So most parents, myself included, it's, hey, if you're drinking, whatever, don't drive, don't get in a car with somebody that's going to drive. And I think nowadays with like Uber and things like that, that may ease our minds a little bit, but I really just want to make it clear at this point in the interview to people that this was nothing to do with driving. This was alcohol poisoning. Kevin drank too much and he died from alcohol poisoning. And Barry sits here now telling this story. Could be anybody watching this telling this story. So please pay attention to this. What are the next few days like as you guys process this and have to make arrangements and, as far as burial for Kevin?
It's ugly, right? You have to tell that story over and over again. You have to plan for a memorial. You have to sort out a little detail like, what are we going to do with his remains? It was just an ugly time. I still remember going to pick up his ashes. We decided to pick up his ashes to cremate him. And I remember walking in the funeral home, and the funeral home's got nice pictures on the wall, and they're playing music in the background, and they take me into this office and set me down in a nice, comfortable chair with a big desk in front of me. And The funeral director walks in and sets an urn down in front of me. An urn that holds all that remains of the kid that I burped, changed his diapers, coached his baseball, basketball, soccer, football. All the remains of him were sitting in an urn in front of me. And there's one thing I knew at that point, and that was that I didn't want to be a victim. Because the world doesn't need any more victims. We've got plenty of them already. The world needs people who take something bad and they make something very good come from it. Because that's really the most you can hope for at that point, is to try to make something good come from it. There's no money in the world that'll fix the hurt. Lawyers will tell you differently. I'm telling you, it's not true. There is no money in the world that'll fix the hurt. The only thing that helps is to try to make something good come from such a senseless tragedy.
Yeah, and Barry, obviously what you're doing is you're doing that. You're trying to make something good come from this. And I'm hoping that through this podcast and all your other speaking engagements, you're getting this message across to people. Barry, I did want to ask something. Before we get into Kevin's last walk, and I don't know if you have it available. I mean, it really touched me. You wrote a letter that you imagined Kevin would write. I was wondering if you could read that.
Yeah, I could do that. This is something I call a letter from heaven. Dear Dad, first I'd like to say how much I miss you and I love you. I'm sorry about what happened. You have no idea how sorry. We were just out having a good time. I didn't think anyone could get hurt. It seemed like so much fun, and everybody was doing it. One minute we were drinking and having a good time, and the next minute I was dead. I want you to know how hard I tried to live, how much I wanted to go back to the beginning of that night and change it all. I never believed it could happen to me. I knew people who had problems with alcohol, but I wasn't one of them. I had so much left to do, Dad. My life was just starting. I was looking forward to coming home and raiding the refrigerator and the pantry. I was looking forward to many more hunting trips and working on the old truck together, getting married and giving you more grandchildren. I will never get to share Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas with you again. No more gifts, no more falling asleep after Thanksgiving dinner. You have so many pictures of me around the house. I know what I did caused everyone great sadness. I know about what you plan to do, and I'll be there with you every step of the way. Tell everyone you can about what happened to me. Tell them how dangerous alcohol abuse can be and how it only takes once for terrible things to happen. Tell all the kids that what can happen is not cool and that it can happen to them. Tell them about the pain it brings to family and friends. Tell them so they don't have to find out the hard way, the way I did. Something very good will come from this, Dad. I just wish I was there to share it with you. I love you and miss you. Your son, Kevin.
Barry, thank you for that. I know that can't be easy. That honestly is one of the most poignant things I've ever read or heard. So thank you for that. So I can tell when you read that letter that, at least to me, it feels like that letter, it's somewhat, I feel like it's you forgiving Kevin. It's also you starting to forgive yourself. And it's also the start of you wanting to not be a victim and make this a positive.
Yeah.
Now the book, Kevin's Last Walk, I want to get into what Kevin's Last Walk actually is and what you did, because I just want to say this. On my podcast, we talk a lot about mindset, being out of your comfort zone, all that good stuff, right?
Yep.
I was thinking, and like me, we're not the youngest guys, right? And I'm like, wow, I mean, there's just a part of this that, when I hear it, I'm like, even what you did, it's amazing to me. And I don't want to ruin it. And I'm glad I got a little bit of a laugh out of you. Now let's start to go a little bit more to the positive, right? So let's tell the audience
Yes.
what you did. And I'll tell you, you're crazy, but that's great. So let's tell the audience what you did.
So we really wrestled with what to do with his ashes. I actually grew up in Montana, and Kevin always talked about wanting to move to Montana someday and buy a ranch. We live in Arizona. So I decided to put them in my backpack and walk there. Again, not to raise money, but to tell the story. And as you said, crazy, I will tell you, there was a lot of people tried to talk me out of it.
Barry,
You completely understand that, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? I'm
Yes.
sorry. I just want to set something. You say I walk from Arizona to Montana, okay? And I know people here go, oh, that's pretty far. How many miles is that?
It's about 1,400 miles.
No.
Took me about 4 months. By the way, I averaged about 90 miles a week. I got chased by more dogs than you can count. But the wonderful thing about that walk is you realize that society isn't all that jaded. There's just a lot of wonderful people out there. I met so many nice people along the way. It really was. I look back on it, Charles, and I think, did I really do that? Was that me? I mean, I'm not independently wealthy. The company I worked for actually did a vacation drive and kept me on the payroll for 4 months while I was gone. People stepped up, but like I said, there was a lot of people tried to talk me out of it, including my dad. Because you can't blame them, because you're thinking, what, you're going to do what? I completely understand it.
So Barry, during the walk, and I know myself, right? And obviously way different circumstances, but I'll use a lot of times if I'm walking or jogging or running or whatnot, right? I do have to ask, there had to be times during this walk where, during that walk, you're alone with the darkness of your own emotions, right? I have to imagine that there are certain times where that starts to creep in. And I would just like to know some of the conversations you have with yourself during that time.
It was, a lot of talk, a lot of media and all that stuff. And for the audience that doesn't know Arizona very well, they think of the desert. Getting out of Arizona was by far the biggest challenge. I started at 1,300 feet, and Flagstaff is at 7,400, with many, many huge ups and downs through there. And I remember, I will tell you exactly where the low spot was. It was before I got to Flagstaff, and I'm just whipped, right? It's raining, it's cold, it's miserable. And I'm thinking, what are you thinking here? You're not going to make it. But at some point, by God's grace, I started not thinking about walking to Montana. I started thinking about walking 3 more miles. My wife met me every 3 miles for 1,400 miles. I just started thinking, I just need to get to the next rest spot. And then I'll take a break and I'll go from there. Because if you think about going 1,400 miles, it gets inside of your head in a big way. And honestly, the further I went, the better I felt. I mean, I had plantar fasciitis. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a very painful thing. But all of that got better. As long as the further I went, the better I felt.
So Barry, I did want to ask you this, and I totally understand if you don't want to answer this, or this may be too personal, but I would imagine at points during this walk, you were having conversations with Kevin.
Well, what I can tell you is that when the wind was behind me, I knew where it was coming from. And at weak points, there was always something that happened that made it all better, because people would stop on the miserable days. People would stop and talk to me. asked me if I needed a ride. What are you doing out here? And those things always came along at the best times. There was just neat stuff that happened along the way. And I know it wasn't an accident.
Yeah, I think you definitely had Kevin was there with you every step of the way. And I feel this walk, you get to the end, you complete this walk. What's the end destination? You get to Montana. What happens at that point?
So we had an official finish for the public. And I told the story again because I stopped and told the story. I don't even know how many times, 30 or 40 or 50 times at schools along the way. And we had to schedule all that. And then we got to the end, we had an official finish, and then we went out and we left his ashes on some property up there. It was a very simple service. And then we just went and had a picnic at a lake after that.
And that seems like a fitting ending, honestly, to the story as far as the last walk. So ultimately, I feel like Kevin, you left him in probably the place where you feel he will be the happiest. And I'm sure that made you feel better. The walk in general had to be therapeutic. So during the walk, you finish the walk. Is that when you finish that walk, is that where you truly are like at the end of the day? And I know, Barry, there has to be obviously some type of regret or you're blaming yourself, right? So the end of that walk, is it finally you feel like I've processed at least through this? Maybe I'm not blaming myself at this point. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm forgiving myself. I'm forgiving Kevin. Is that it there at the end of that walk? Or was there still more for you to go as far as processing this?
You never finish processing it. That's the reality of it. I've spoke to a few people about grief, and sometimes they don't like what I tell them, but here's the thing. When your child dies, the old you died with them. And as much as you want, and it took me years to figure this out, that the old you is gone, a new you is born. It can be a better you. But the old you is gone. You're never going to feel the way you did before that night. You just won't. And I think that's, it's now 17 years in the rearview mirror for me. You're just never going to feel the same. So you continue to process. And of course, for me, the question I asked myself was, okay, what's next? Because I don't know what something very good is. I just know that that's what I've got to do. And then the book came up. I never planned to write the book. I never did any public speaking before I did this. I can safely say I think I sucked in the beginning because I didn't really understand what audiences needed to hear. And I've told the story, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 times. And it's just important to just tell people, just want to hear a story. That's really, they don't want to be preached to. And when I talk to kids, one of the first things I tell them is that I'm not here to tell them how to live their life. I'm just here to tell you a story. And as you listen to it, think about what you want your story to be.
Barry, I can say this to you, knowing 17 years in the rearview mirror, and I will say this, that the story right now, today on this podcast, it's still resonating and coming across as powerful as probably the first time you ever told it. So I give you credit. It's resonates with me, and I'm sure it's going to resonate with the audience also. Barry, the other thing I want to get into, I know we touched on this briefly before the podcast started, but you mentioned faith. And I know nowadays, sometimes, it's unfortunate, but faith sometimes becomes a little bit taboo. And, some people may not like to go down that path, but I'm not that guy. I want to go down that path with you. And okay. I'm going to ask you for an honest answer. When this happens, I know that people, when things like this happen, I thank God for everything. I can't blame God. I would honestly, Barry, did you did you blame God?
Of course I did. Anybody that says they didn't blame God in the beginning, of course you do. I was mad. I didn't understand why he didn't take me instead of him, right? I can remember having very angry conversations with him where I was doing all the talking and, back up time, take me, don't take him. But 3 days after Kevin passed away, I had another life-changing event, and I'm just going to tell you what it was. I was laying in bed when I felt like someone had walked in the room. There was a light I've never seen before and haven't seen since. But the message was clear. Kevin didn't suffer, and that something very good would come from this. Why it happened to me, I don't know. I'm not the right guy, but as my bride pointed out to me one time, God chooses the unimpressive to do their work, doesn't do his work. So all I know is I got to make something very good come from this. I don't know what it is, but it was as you can imagine, it was a life changer for me.
And Barry, you know what? I can kind of say this to you, I think, with some assurance, and you probably will never know this answer truly, but something tells me that 17 years of doing this and speaking about this, going through this, I can only imagine how many people you've touched and how many people's lives that may have been saved because of this. And I think there's no way that anybody could convince me that of all the talks you've done and all the people you've spoken to, that this has not at the very least saved one person. I would guarantee it. So I think the good thing to come of this is, and you say, the unimpressive, but it's impressive. You're saving lives. And I don't know any other way to say it. You're saving lives. As soon as I heard your story, I said, that man is saving people's lives and saving their children's lives, because, I feel like we all think about, and you were starting to go through this with Kevin, for our kids, we think about all the decisions they're going to make, all the big decisions, right? And what you're doing is you're talking to people about what may be two of the biggest decisions they may need to make in their life, right? And that is, how are they going to handle and respond to drugs and alcohol? And I don't think enough attention is paid to it, because these are the two areas in their lives that they don't understand, that if you make the wrong decision, it can cost you everything. And you had to experience that. And what you're doing now, though, is hopefully saving other people from experiencing that. So I can only commend you for that. Barry, I wanted to kind of end with this. I wanted to give you a chance right now to just, as you're looking into the camera and talk to my audience, if you just from your heart, what would you say to parents right now as a way to get this message across and maybe bring their attention to it so that this doesn't happen to them?
So there's three things that I think are important to take away from this. And you've touched on most of it already. The first one is about decision making. The two most important decisions that you or your children are ever going to make are about drugs and alcohol. It isn't even close, as you alluded to. That's a big deal. You need to educate your children and yourselves about the dangers of drug and alcohol abuse, as if your life and the lives of your children depend upon it. Because it does. It's as simple as that. And the second thing is about adversity. Bad stuff happens to everybody. The way you respond to adversity is going to define your life. Notice I didn't say it might define your life. You can probably think of times in your life where bad stuff has happened, and it's the way you handle it that defines your life. And forgiveness, it's last but not least. It was easy for me to forgive the guys at the party because this was Kevin's choice, right? His decision. And you forgive your son. But there's one person that's pretty tough to forgive. And everybody knows who that was. It was me. It took 1,400 miles and 5 pairs of shoes, but I have found a way to forgive myself. I heard a pastor describe it best once. He said, anger and vengeance lead to one thing: destruction. Forgiveness leads to healing. And sometimes the most important person you need to forgive is yourself. Because none of us are perfect, right? We all make mistakes. It's how you handle it that makes the difference.
And Barry, well, I think that was a very powerful and poignant way to end this podcast. I can only again thank you and commend you on your courage. Last but not least, any your book, Kevin's Last Walk, available Amazon, places like that? You want to just let people know where they can get that?
Yeah, the book's available on Amazon. The best way to get a hold of me is on Facebook. It's Kevin's Last Walk. And I will say that if we can work it out, I'll go wherever somebody wants me to go and just tell the story. I can tell you that I've told this story in front of 1,200 kids, and the principal comes up afterwards and says, I have never seen this auditorium that quiet. He said you could hear a pin drop in there. Again, I'm not a preacher. I'm just telling a story. And I still do it at schools. I'm going to do a school on Monday. I still do it pretty regularly.
Yeah, so please, everyone, if you can, check out Barry, purchase the book. I'm going to actually get the book. I would love to read the book, go into a little more detail. And Barry, I wish you nothing but continued healing, I'll say. And again, thank you for what you're doing. And I hope that you continue doing this and that you don't get discouraged, because we need this. Our kids need it. This world needs it. So keep it up. Just do me a favor. Don't walk 1,400 miles again. We need to keep you healthy so you can give this talk. Okay. So let's keep the walking to a minimum at this point. All right.
We'll do it.
All right. Well, Barry, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening. Take care.
Thanks, Charles.
This has been the Bear Essentials. Thanks for listening. And remember, never hibernate on your goals.